Margaret Atwood is perhaps one of the greatest living writers today. Her Handmaid's Tale and its continuation, Testaments, is seen by many as prophetic. I invited her to talk about dangers, but also about our hopes, about that part of human nature that will help us overcome the challenges of the dark times. You're listening to the podcast Thinking in Dark Times, run by UkraineWorld, an English language media about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a chief editor of UkraineWorld and the president of PEN Ukraine. You can support our work at Patreon. You will find the link in the description. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas via PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. So let's begin. Margaret Atwood, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you.
So, as I told you before we started recording, I actually asked my Ukrainian readers, to ask you questions. And the first reaction will be excitement that there will be such a conversation. And the second reaction from many people was thank you. So, a lot of people read your work in Ukraine, and a lot of people appreciate it.
Thank you.
So one of the, of course, recurrent question is about totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and I guess you were asked these questions many times. Like, is the Handmaid's Tale a prophetic work? How did you achieve this in 1985? But my question will be a little bit different, and this is also a question from many Ukrainian readers. Do you see that what is going on right now is actually implementing those warnings that you were thinking about, or there is something different?
Well, it's not implementing the exact warning, so I don't think we're going to have everybody wearing red robes and white bonnets. I don't think that will happen. But are we in a period of renewed authoritarianism and totalitarianism? Yes, obviously. Some people are trying it on. So one of the models for me is the French Revolution, which started out with all of these ideals, and they wrote a constitution, and they were going to make all these reforms. And then it just fell apart into the Great Terror, and then along comes Napoleon. So how do these things go? And what I see as happening in the United States right now is a right-wing version of that kind of revolution. And what they always want to do is tear everything down, get rid of the existing order, so they can build the brave new world from the ground up. But somehow that doesn't really have a habit of happening. Or as somebody else said, they aren't, once they get going, they don't implement the ideas that have brought them into being. They create a power vacuum into which all kinds of forces can rush.
Let me ask about your life and the way how your life actually helped you to conceptualize the story of Handmaid's Tale and the Testaments. So in 1980s, many people were very optimistic. We know that especially by the end of 1980s. And in 1990s, I think a lot of people in the world thought that, look, the major battle against authoritarianism is over.
Yeah, right.
and there is a final victory. But I feel that people who have kind of a deeper roots and look at the past. So you look at French Revolution,
Yeah.
we look at some other elements, other episodes.
Well, all of the other revolutions that followed the French Revolution, including the Russian, and were modeled upon it.
But I'm very skeptical about the idea that we can have a final victory over something. We can have a final victory over authoritarianism. I rather see the world as always recurrent and all these instincts of power and violence coming back. How do you see it?
Well, I would agree with you, and history will bear us out. So yes, there isn't any final, and there isn't any inevitable progress. So there is no yellow brick road that leads to the Emerald City of Oz with no going back. Instead, you get cycles, as you yourself will know perfectly well. I often use the picture on the tarot pack of the Wheel of Fortune, especially the very old cards. They showed the wheel, it's being turned by the goddess Fortune, and she's blind. And there are 4 figures in it. One of them is at the top, and he's saying in Latin, I rule. One of them is coming up the left-hand side, and he says, I will rule. The other one is falling off on the right-hand side, and he's saying, I have ruled. And then underneath it, there's a peasant holding up the entire wheel, and he is saying, I will never rule. So it's more like that than it is like inevitable progress and everything's going to be wonderful forever. That has never happened yet.
It's amazing that you mentioned this Wheel of Fortune, because I love this metaphor very much. I also think that this goddess of fortune, or I think the Greeks called it Tuche or something like this, is a very, very interesting creature. And I think that when a person called Machiavelli was thinking that this principe can actually hold fortune and possess it, he was very much mistaken. And probably all the tyrants are thinking that, look, I will probably possess this fortune for forever, but they fail.
Well, that's why they become tyrants, because once they get up to the top, they want to stop the wheel from turning, and with themselves remaining at the top, because they know that if they cannot stop the wheel from turning, they're going to fall off and be crushed underneath. So, because they have used usually quite repressive and brutal means to get to the top, they know they have a lot of enemies. And they also know that some people within their own entourage would like to get rid of them, so that those people within their own entourage can take their place. So when we're saying read this, read that, one of the things I suggest people read is Macbeth.
I adore Macbeth. I'm actually teaching it to my students. I will share with you one story. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the other one would be Julius Caesar.
But let me tell you a story about Macbeth. When the full-scale war started, one of my courses at Kyiv Mohila Academy, our oldest university, was about philosophy and literature. And I asked myself, so I need to change the curricula because we need to talk about something else. And I was thinking, so how I change the curricula? What works will I give to my students? And will there be books about war, about violence? And I decided that no, I would give them dramas, only dramas. Right. Because dramas is a genre where the time has accelerated, when there is acceleration of time. And I think this makes it a difference with the novel. And one of the pieces was Macbeth, and I was giving it also because there is a story of Ukrainian translation of Macbeth made by Todosio Smachka, our famous writer, and he published it in 1930. And for me, 1930 is actually the year of when Stalin comes to power fully and when he starts repressions, right? So the story of Macbeth is also a story of Stalin a little bit. So my question to you would be, the classics knew it all. The classics from Euripides, Aeschylus, Shakespeare, they perfectly knew it, and they gave us a key to it, right?
Because they knew human nature. And despite all of our talk about technology changing human nature, it doesn't, because it would take a very long evolutionary time to change the actual floor plan of humanity, the basics. It's very difficult to change those just by having everybody on their iPhone. Yes, so they knew human nature, and the stories that they told were about human nature, as are all of the stories of all cultures, in all times, and in all languages. Even if they say they're about rabbits, they're still about human beings. Anything that talks.
Yeah. But what is it about human nature that brings the tyrannies back? Is it power instinct? Is it the violence instinct? Is it that humans want violence and power?
Yeah, well, some do, but most don't. I think what happens is that the existing order gets too weak, or in the case of the French Revolution, too broke. And then of course people get very discontented because they're not eating, and anger builds up, and forces rush in to fill the power vacuum. So I don't think that Robespierre, when he started out, intended to be a tyrant. He really did want equality, fraternity, and liberty, whatever that might mean. So he didn't start out as badly intentioned. But then, of course, once you get into the conflicts and people who don't like what you're doing and try to overthrow you, you either get more ruthless or you get dead. So I think that is one of the patterns that we see. We also see the fact that one of the first things these outfits do is purge their own members. And that's what Trump has been doing. That is certainly what Stalin did. And it is what Robespierre did too. Because within your own members, let us call it the X party. No, maybe we better not call it that. Let's call it the M party. Within the M party, there are going to be people who want your job.
And I think even that there is something deeper than that, is that people who become tyrants actually understand that the only instrument by which they can rule is death. And,
or fear.
Fear, but they produced fear by producing death. The death is the best instrument to produce fear, and therefore they actually say to everybody, I own your death. Your death belongs to me. That I can take your life whenever I can.
Exactly, that is what they say. Or as Lenin said, we need a terror.
One of the questions that I was asked by one Ukrainian reader is that you often explore I quote, you often explore the fragile boundaries between dystopia and reality, power and resistance. In times of wars and ecological collapse, what philosophical ideas or thinkers do you personally return to clarify or solace? What would you say?
You mean who cheers me up?
A little bit, yeah. Who gives you hope?
Just about nobody.
But who gives you hope?
Who gives me hope? Well, I think hope is just built in. I think that human beings have hope the way they have anger and appreciation of sunsets and lots of other things. Because if you're not hopeful at all, you don't get up in the morning. So I think we all, unless we're extremely depressed, we all have hope. And our hope, even if it's just the sun will rise this morning, we all have some form of hope. And I think that what gives me hope at the moment is the fact that unstable systems do not persist. So if I were a betting person, I would make book on how long is it going to take the Trump administration to fall apart.
Yeah.
It's very unstable.
Yeah, it seems to be as well. But then the question is, again, whether the tyrants are trying to stabilize it by what I was calling recently thanatocracy, meaning the rule by death and the rule by fear.
Yeah, for sure, and that's what he's trying to do, but because it is the United States, and you can't just go out and kill a lot of people without there being quite a bit of pushback, and there already is a lot of pushback. He can't just clamp everything down and kill a bunch of people. He can't do a Night of the Long Knives in the same way that Hitler did. Of course, that may be way too optimistic. Maybe he can. let's find out. I canceled my own proposed travel to the United States in April because I didn't want to end up in an orange jumpsuit in Arizona.
Let me come back a little bit again to the classics, and I was so excited when I found that you wrote a novel or a book about Odyssey, and it's called the
Yes, right.
the Penelope.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that was a lot of fun.
And why I liked it so much, because I myself has a novel about Odysseus, and it's interesting how it's the story is so magnetic that you come back to it all the time. So we have lots of stories about rewriting Odysseus, but you're trying to do it from the viewpoint of Penelope and from the viewpoint of young ladies whom Odysseus killed when he returned.
Yes, exactly.
And this is very interesting because you basically try to deconstruct this myth about Odysseus' hero. And you try to say that, well, behind these heroic acts, there are actually killings, and very often killings of innocent people. And then the question is, but why Penelope needed to wait for 20 years? And just make her life a function of Odysseus' life. So what would you say about this book?
Yeah, I'm not sure she had a lot of choice. What I would say about the Odyssey itself, or about my retelling, or both?
Your retelling. I'm interested in your retelling. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So how did I do it? It was part of a series called the Myth series, in which writers around the world were asked to take a myth, any myth, and retell it in a novel of not more than 50,000 words. So when I was looking for one, having rashly agreed to do it before I knew what I was going to do it about, that story came to me, which I had read as a teenager and had always thought that the girls who were hanged were treated unfairly. I thought that then. Because what, in fact, had they done? We called them maids, but in fact they were slaves. And what they did seems to have been to choose one suitor to be raped by rather than all of them. And the other thing they did, which was held against them, was that when Odysseus turns up disguised as a beggar, they're not welcoming to him. But they were not the hosts. It wasn't up to them to be welcoming to him. So I always thought it was unfair. And the other thing about the original poem is that Penelope doesn't do much in it. So we see her weeping a lot. We see her having strange dreams. We see her sacrificing wheat. But she must also have been running the kingdom, because nobody else was. The father, who possibly ought to have been running it, was over on the other side of the island, cultivating pear trees. So in preparation for writing my version, I reread the original a lot of times. And I also read the alternate versions of this story, which are not in Homer, but are in Robert Graves's collection of them. And in some of those versions, things are quite different. Instead of being the faithful wife, she's been sleeping with those suitors. But the other thing to note about Odysseus and Penelope is both of them are first-class liars. So they're they're well suited to each other. But we could say also that that hero never meant to the ancient Greeks. It never meant you were a nice person. It meant that you accomplished noteworthy things, but you weren't morally upright in all respects ever. So you shouldn't expect Greek heroes to be well behaved in all ways, because they're not.
This is, by the way, how many classics were depicting heroes. I'm thinking about Racine and his version of Theseus and Hippolytus, when Hippolytus is a good person, but Theseus is not, and he's precisely this chthonic hero that is hero precisely because he's very violent, he's very brutal, and he's very strong, etc. And this leads me to another question about the way how we read the classic stories. So how we read all these, myths and dramas, because for me, they're very magnetic. I love them so much because they basically they exist through time. They're transhistorical. We can read them as if they were written, now, but at the same time they hide a lot of problems in themselves. They hide a lot of moral problems, and in Penelope you discover these moral problems. What is your attitude to these big ancient stories?
The big ancient stories, well, they're the prototypes of superhero comic books, as I'm sure you know, including the disguises that superheroes often have. They have a person that they are in normal life, and then they transform into something that can fly through the air and kill you with electricity. So this is straight out of the ancient playbook in which the gods disguised themselves, sometimes as human beings and sometimes as things like swans and cows. So what can I say? I think they're foundational. There are three groups of stories that are foundational to subsequent literature. And one of them is Greek and Roman mythology. One of them is biblical. And one of them is the folklore of any given country. So in Europe, that would include what we call fairy tales. And amongst indigenous people in Canada, those would be foundational myths.
When I look at these stories, I will tell you my actually approach to them, and I see two major themes. One is this theme of a hero, which I don't use as a pathetic word. I use it in a very practical term. For me, hero is somebody who challenges the stronger, because this creature is in between the world of the world of the mortals and the world of the immortals, and therefore he or she gets this challenge to challenge the stronger, the gods or the stronger man or challenges. Another story is, I think, that it was Nietzsche understood about Greek tragedy and about drama, is that they're really they're very pessimistic about human nature. They're not having the rosy glasses on this. They're actually showing that the terrible, the horrible can come out very, very easily, and we should prepare to this. And I think these both things are actually very important for me personally, because this second element tells you that we are never immune to evil. Evil will always come back. This is our human nature. And the first one is that, but we still can challenge it, and we can still have strength and hope, even when we think that, fighting against it seems to be impossible. What would you say?
I would agree with you. And not just Greek and Roman. It's Beowulf, isn't it? The old Anglo-Saxon poem in which It's got two parts. In the first part, he overcomes the monster Grendel and an even worse monster, Grendel's mother, and saves all these people from being eaten. But that's when he's young. So in part two, the culture is being menaced by a dragon. Beowulf is quite old, but he goes out and fights the dragon anyway. He does kill it, but he dies himself. They weren't full of rosy happiness either, the old Anglo-Saxons. But that is what I think what is embodied in the notion of the hero. It's someone who doesn't refuse a challenge, even when quite old. Being old now myself, I like that story.
And it's interesting that these old stories were actually talking about glory in the way how we no longer talk today, because this old literature was about glory, and glory means that even if you're weaker and you challenge the stronger and you die, it's glory that lives after your death. It's in a way an attempt to overcome death. So we no longer talk in this way. We are the moderns. We talk in the terminology of criticism and skepticism, but not in the terms of glory. I don't know whether it's good or bad.
I think that change came because people wanted to discourage militarism. After the Second World War, I think people really didn't. Things had been so awful that that kind of glory had lost its gleam. Let us put it that way. I think it was still there after World War I, but not after World War II. However, I think some of that is now coming back because people see similar conditions recurring, fight or die, or possibly fight and die. So I know that in Canada anyway, in the 80s and 90s, they stopped teaching military history, but they've started again.
Yeah, because I think that, it's good when we think about how to prevent evil, but it seems that the Western world stopped thinking what to do when the evil is there, how to stand up to evil.
Well, because they foolishly thought that when the Cold War was over and the Berlin Wall came down, that was it. Let's all just go shopping.
Yeah.
Have a good time. Well, somebody wrote a book called The End of History. Yeah. History doesn't end.
Exactly, yeah.
And by the way, there is no right side or wrong side of history because history doesn't have sides.
Yeah.
There's nothing that says that your good side will inevitably win.
When you look at Ukraine, when you look at news from Ukraine, today we had a horrible attack by Russia, 70 missiles and 150 drones. And again, dead people and wounded people. When you look at it and when you look how Americans are Trump is trying to appease Putin, what do you think?
I think he's foolish. But I also think he's made a secret real estate deal. We don't know what went on at that meeting between Putin and Trump. When he came out of it, people asked him what had happened, and he said, none of your business. So we don't know what he's been up to behind the scenes. We don't know what kind of deal they've cut. But I think it's extremely foolish. And if you've seen somebody violate their agreement already once, why would you think they would keep any agreement they make with you?
When you look at the world that you described in Handmaid's Tale, and this is the world of very vertical world, right? When some people are on the top, some people are subordinate, some people are slaves, some people are functionalized. women are treated only as people who give birth to somebody on the top. What is the alternative? What is the ideal society you think about, or you don't think in those terms, and you'd rather warn people of something bad without really making utopias and invite them to dream about something good?
Yes. So the problem with utopias as a literary form is that they're boring. If everything's perfect, it's always the problem people have had with God. If God is perfect, where's the plot? He's just perfect. And that is the difficulty that Milton had with Paradise Lost. The interesting parts are about Satan, whereas people just tend to skip over the parts about God because there he is sitting on a throne in glory. And we don't even know why there has to be a battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, because if God is so perfect and all-powerful, it should be over right then and there. So it is a problem, and it's the same problem with utopias. How do you make them interesting? There were tons of them in the 19th century, a very utopian century. They really did think that progress would continue to progress and that things would get much better, and that's what gave birth to these various revolutions. We can improve it, we can do better. But then the 20th century comes along and the literary utopia goes out the window. People aren't writing them anymore. Because why? Because World War I, all of that violence, World War II, you're going to write a novel about a perfect world? Excuse me. But I did get some requests from people saying, does it always have to be dystopias? Every dystopia has within it a little utopia, which is usually the world before the dystopia took over. And every utopia has a little dystopia in it, which is often the past history of the utopia, why things got this way, but sometimes is an area of land outside the utopia. It's an interesting form to study. I wanted to write a dystopic novel from the point of view of a woman, because most of the ones up until that time had been from the point of view of men. However, in response to the question, why is everything always so gloomy, I said, let's do a project called Practical Utopias. A lot of utopias were tried in the 19th and then the first part of the 20th century, but none of them worked out because they weren't practical. They quite often started from theory and then tried to impose the theory on real events and places. And that almost never works out because it doesn't come from the ground up. It doesn't come from the conditions that people are actually living in. So we had 200 online participants, and we told them that the mandate was that they had to start with the practical things first. So where are we going to live? What are we going to eat? What will we wear? How much will it cost? Where are you going to get the water? How are you going to use materials that are close at hand, or are you going to import them? How is it all going to work? So we gave them that puzzle to solve at first, and then after they had worked on that, we gave them the problem of governance to solve. So how is it going to be governed? Are you going to have a monarchy? Will you have a dictatorship? Will you have some form of democracy? And if so, what form? Are you going to have a wise council of elders? Are you going to have an anarchy? What do liberty and equality and fraternity actually mean? Nobody's ever really figured it out. So they set to work and they came up with some very interesting utopias. They're called practical utopias, and they were told that perfection was not the aim, because there is no such thing, but improvement was. And they were pretty good, except they shirked a couple of questions. And one of them was about enforcement. Are you going to have, what if somebody doesn't agree with you? What if somebody violates the rules? What if somebody is a criminal? How will you handle that? And they didn't really want to think too hard about that because, of course, in their utopia, why would anybody do that? You know the answer. Human nature. And the second thing they had to think about was money. Are you going to use money? How will you exchange things? Or are you going to use some form of barter? Or is everything just going to be free to everyone? How will that all work? And these are core problems with any society. In fact, everything I've mentioned is something that every human society has always had to deal with. So education, healthcare, they had to think about that too. Who's going to have the babies? Who's going to bring up the babies? No babies, no society. All of those questions.
It's amazing how you, a writer, is actually a very good and strong political philosopher. So, and actually, when you look at the history of the world literature, you have a lot of novels, you have a lot of dramas, who are actually a very strong political philosophy treatises or political philosophy texts, which are probably more useful to read than read classical political philosophy. What do you think?
Well, I think that that language contains inherent moral judgments. So if you're working in language, and if you're telling stories, you cannot evade the moral side. You don't have to spell it out, but your readers will make those decisions whether you want them to or not. They will decide which character they approve of. They will decide, did that person act in a right way? I would have done that differently. They will decide whether they think the characters are good or bad, and you cannot stop them from doing that because that is how we all think anyway. I've just met this person. Did I like them? I've just learned that this amazing writer, whose work I really love, had a shady double life and was really quite badly behaved. How are you going to judge that yourself? So we always do that every day. Shall I go into the grocery store and shall I look at all the labels to see if the item is made in Canada or the United States? Because every Canadian is doing that right now. And what is our moral judgment about? Our moral judgment is about the fact that we don't want to be the 51st state. Thanks very much.
How I wanted to ask this question actually, and you just led to it. I was listening to your podcast conversations in which you tell the story of how you came into literature and in the Canadian context. And what I understood suddenly is that there are lots of parallels with the Ukrainian context, because you were saying that it was very difficult to be published as a Canadian author. The Canadian book market was overwhelmed by the American or British authors, and it was kind of a situation in a little bit inferior position, and you're struggling, and other Canadian authors are struggling to have the voice heard. So how do you relate the, let's say, Canadian American story and Ukrainian Russian story?
Well, we're both in a situation in which a larger, more aggressive power is right next to us, and has been dominant, partly just through sheer size. We're not big countries. How many people in Ukraine?
Well, it's difficult to say.
Yes, I know, but
it was 45, 48 million, and now it's probably about 30 because of lots of
right,
refugees.
death and immigration. Well, I'd say we're approximately the same size, give or take. But neither of us is over 50 million. And back when I was born, Canada was a lot smaller, like a lot smaller, maybe 15 million. And of course, everybody in North America and Europe was affected by World War II. I was born in 1939, just 2 months after it started. And people my age tend to think in those terms, but one of the things we think is that before and during the war, we identified much more strongly with Britain. And after it, because of the war, there was a capital vacuum in Canada because we'd put so much of it into the war. And American money came in to fill that. They stayed out of it, as you know, until 1941. So Canada put a lot into the British side of that war. But after that war, the balance of power shifted because Britain was basically broke, and America became a dominant world power. But are we seeing that falling apart right now? That we may well be. China may be the next superpower. So what did we do as young writers in the 60s? Well, part of the picture was that before about 1935, there hadn't been any paperbacks. There had been cheap hardback books, but there hadn't been the paperback situation that then developed. When it did develop, none of those companies were based in Canada. We had hardback publishers, but we did not have paperbacks. We do now, but we didn't then. So Canadian writers tended to appear and then disappear because they didn't have a continuing life in a cheaper format. So one of the things we did was we formed our own publishing companies and also our own magazines. I think the generation before mine generally went to a cosmopolitan area such as London, New York, or Paris. But my generation, for some reason, decided to stay in Canada and build, which is what we then did.
Yes, it's a very important to stay and to be loyal to your country and to your locality. Maybe my last question: why do we need to read? I'm sorry, probably it's a very stupid question, but I'm thinking about this all the time, and I will give you my answer first, and then we'll be very interested in listening to yours. So for me, books are actually the windows to the other worlds. It's like I'm very into this Leibnizian idea of the other possible worlds, of plurality of possible worlds. And I think that the books are actually those windows that we can a little bit probably live some other lives. So include some other lives into our own. And it can be that dystopian lives as you try to do in some of your books, or this or it can be historical novels, or it can be just books from other countries, other experience from there and then instead of here and now. And what is your response to that?
Well, according to the neurophysiologists, reading a literary novel with psychological detail is the closest to actually being there that you can come. Because With movies, a lot of that work is done for you. So you're looking, but you're not creating. When you read a book, there are two creators. One is the writer, and the other is the reader, because you're filling in the sound effects, what things smelled like, what people looked like. My hero of the novel doesn't look the same as yours, unless we've got that look cemented by watching a well-done movie. So your brain is very active, and it's almost as active as if you were undergoing the experiences yourself. It's also the closest you will come to actually being inside somebody else's head, because most of the time we're not. We meet people, we follow rules of politeness, people aren't necessarily expressing what they think. Maybe that's a good thing. So you don't know whether what you see is what you're getting. But with a well-articulated character in a book, you're behind the scenes. You can see them behaving one way and thinking in another way. And who is our model for that? Odysseus.
Again.
Sneaky guy. Yes, he's the first sneaky guy. And the stories about him emphasize that. You know, how clever he was, how underhanded, how sneaky. The Trojan horse was his idea. And how much he fibs. So when we hear him telling his story, we don't know how much of it is true.
Yes, again, we came back to Odysseus. Thank you so much, Margaret Atwood. Thank you very much for this conversation.
And good luck to you and to everybody else.
And let me pass the thank you words from your Ukrainian readers, and really big appreciation for your work.
Thank you very much.
This was a podcast, Thinking in Dark Times, by UkraineWorld, an English language media about Ukraine, based in Kyiv. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am the chief editor of UkraineWorld, the president of Pan-Ukraine. I'm also a Ukrainian philosopher. My guest today was Margaret Atwood, who is perhaps one of the greatest living writers today. Don't forget to support us at Patreon. You will find the link in the description. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas via PayPal, ukraine.resisting.gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.